Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 472. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Happy to have you back on the show. We got quite a bit to go over today, so let's just jump right into it. Remind people they can find the show just about anywhere you could find these kinds of shows: YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, anywhere you could listen to audio podcast. It's hosted through the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, and you could follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. And with that, let's jump into the news today. I got a quick one on Assange before we get into the Ukraine war updates. And this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. More than 60 Australian lawmakers urge U.S. to drop charges against Assange. A group of 63 members of Australia's parliament have urged the U.S. to drop charges against Assange, against WikiLeaks founder and Australian citizen Julian Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison if extradited to the U.S. and convicted for exposing U.S. war crimes. According to The Guardian, the 63 members of parliament, which include Australia's House of Representatives and Senate, said in a letter that if Assange is extradited, there will be a sharp and sustained outcry in Australia. Assange has been held in London's Belmarsh prison for over 4 years on no charges, as the U.S. is trying to extradite and imprison him for publishing documents obtained by a source, a standard journalistic practice. If Assange is convicted, it would have grave implications for press freedom in the U.S. and around the world. The Australian lawmaker said the letter that they were resolutely of the view that prosecution and incarceration of the Australian citizen Julian Assange must end. They expressed support for a cross-party Australian Parliament delegation that is due to visit Washington next week to lobby for Assange's freedom. And Connor, this seems to me one of the larger outpourings of support for Julian Assange from kind of members of, more the establishment class. So this is a lot of Australian members of parliament. We will see if it makes any difference. There has been a lot of, protest efforts and campaigns to try to get the U.S. government to stop the prosecution of Julian Assange. And really, he's been imprisoned in one way or another by Washington since, I guess, 2012. And, it hasn't happened. So I'm not particularly optimistic that this will break the U.S. siege and extradition attempt on Assange. It is possible that, kind of continue to break barriers and get more people to realize how toxic this prosecution is. All right, next up here, article by Dave DeCamp. This is very important. The New York Times reported Wednesday that Russia has been able to significantly ramp up its production of ammunition and other armaments despite Western sanctions meant to degrade the country's military industry. According to one senior Western defense official, before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia could produce 100 tanks a year. Now they can make 200. Western officials also believe Russia is on track to produce 2 million artillery shells per year, twice the amount they estimate Russia could make before the war. As a result of the increased production, Russia can make more ammunition than the U.S. and Europe combined. The U.S. and its NATO allies are working to bolster their production, but results aren't expected to be seen for years. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg previously said that Ukraine was using artillery rounds at a faster rate than the alliance could produce them. And so I think a lot of the significance here, Connor, is that, in the West, they're looking at a very sustained long war effort here in Ukraine. And if Russia, a larger country, is outproducing Ukraine in arms, especially on key things like artillery rounds, this seems to be should be a major concern for Kiev and their war effort. But I'm not seeing a whole lot of, concern being raised about how Ukraine is supposed to win this war of attrition. They just, say with enough support over the long run, somehow they're going to prevail. All right, next up here. Ukraine hits Russian shipyards in Crimea with cruise missile. So this, of course, comes after we covered not earlier this week on the show, that Secretary of State Antony Blinken had given a big green light to Ukraine to carry out attacks inside of Russia. And now we're seeing Ukraine launch a barrage of cruise missiles at a Russian shipyard in Sevastopol, Ukraine. There are at least 2 warships that were damaged and 24 people that were injured. The Russian side seemed to downplay the significance of the attack, Connor, saying that these ships would soon be able to sail again soon. But who knows? It could be a little bit more significant of a blow to Russia's naval fleet than Moscow is trying to pretend right now. They say a total of 10 cruise missiles were launched, and I believe those were those Storm Shadow cruise missiles that the UK has been supplying to Ukraine. All right, next up here. NATO says no risk of Romania being dragged into Russia-Ukraine war. And this is from the NATO Deputy Secretary General, who is actually a Romanian politician, that said that there was no risk NATO member Romania would be dragged into the Russia-Ukraine war after Bucharest said drone fragments were found on Ukrainian territory. And I do have this story. I wrote it up for the Libertarian Institute. Connor, Romania, drone fragments from Ukraine war do not pose a threat. And so this is basically just a recap of a story I wrote last week for antiwar.com. It appears because these fragments were in a similar area, it could have been from the same exact incident, or it could have been from a different one. It's also possible that this has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. Romania says they're going to do tests on these pieces of drone and see if they could determine the country of origin. I suppose it's possible that this is from Ukrainian air defenses, or maybe Ukraine was trying to launch some kind of drone system which Russia intercepted as it was taking off. There's so many potential options of what's going on in this war and how things could end up, just less than a mile away across the border in Romania. But again, Connor, I think the very important thing here is that both NATO and Romania are downplaying this incident, saying that this isn't a threat, this isn't a reason for a Russia-NATO war. And so we're going to try to see some threat inflation coming, I think, particularly from Kiev, particularly from the American media. But it's good to see that Brussels and Bucharest are not interested in a wider war. All right, Connor, this is another article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Russia's Putin and North Korea's Kim hold talks, seek to form unbreakable relations. And so this happened earlier this week. The North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un met with Russian President Vladimir Putin and held talks aimed at deepening ties between Moscow and Pyongyang. While the leaders were tight-lipped about details of the discussions, cooperation in the military and space arenas were on the table. Putin hosted Kim at a Russian spaceport. When asked if Russia would assist North Korea's satellite program, Putin responded, "That's why we're here." The leader of the North Korea shows a great interest in rocket engineering. They are also trying to develop space. And it's always hard to know exactly what's going on in North Korea, Connor, but recently there have been some, not recently as in the past month, but recently as in over the past couple of years, North Korea has tried to launch a couple satellites, and I don't think those test launches and launches have been particularly successful. So Putin met with Kim for 5 hours, including a formal state dinner and a one-on-one discussion that lasted about an hour. The nature of most of the talks between the leaders is unknown. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov explained, as neighbors, our countries implement cooperation in sensitive areas that should not become the subject of public disclosure and announcement. This is quite natural for neighboring states. Peskov added that no documents were signed following the meeting. Prior to Kim's visit to Russia, American officials said that Pyongyang was planning to supply Moscow with weapons for the war in Ukraine. South Korea State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller threatened to sanction North Korea if it increased military cooperation with Russia. Of course, even if the U.S. did sanction North Korea, I don't think it would make a difference. North Korea is a pretty isolated country, in part by choice, and then also because of extensive international sanctions, not only coming from Washington, but even from the UN on North Korea. During the summit, Kim voiced support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, Russia has risen to fight the sacred fight to protect its sovereignty and security against the hegemonic forces that oppose Russia, and now we want to further develop this relationship. We will always support the decisions of President Putin and the Russian leadership. I also hope that we will be together in the fight against imperialism and for the construction of a sovereign state. Both leaders discussed the long-standing relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang, and I think it's notable, Connor, that both leaders noted the military support that the Soviet Union, but Moscow, provided to North Korea during the Korean War, and what the North Koreans see as their war for liberation and sovereignty. So kind of interesting, when you look at Kim's rhetoric there. And then, of course, just one last quote from Kim Jong-un here. Moscow and Washington will form an unbreakable relations of strategic cooperation. And with that, Connor, I will hand it over to you to let you update us on what the hell is going on in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got major war drills coming up with the U.S. and Israel. They're going to be simulating attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. So this is from Dave DeCamp on August 31st. The U.S. and Israel will simulate striking Iranian nuclear facilities as part of a series of joint military exercises that will be held during the coming months. And this was from a Times of Israel report, which cited some Israeli media reports. So back in January, the U.S. and Israel conducted the Juniper Oak exercises, which were the largest ever joint drills between the two countries. The Israeli military said that Juniper Oak was just the first of a series of drills that Washington and Tel Aviv will be holding this year. So Israel's Channel 12 reported one of the upcoming drills is going to simulate Israel facing a multi-front missile attack that will involve the U.S. deployment of the Patriot missile systems, and another drill will rehearse a joint U.S.-Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. The plan to simulate attacks on Iran has not been publicly confirmed by the U.S. or Israel, but the two nations have previously rehearsed bombing Iran, including during drills that were held over the Mediterranean Sea last November. And so, I mean, doing these drills where they're simulating multi-front missile attacks is very reminiscent of the drills that Israel held earlier this year, which were called Firm Hand. And of course, so we covered those quite a bit on the show. And Michael Kurilla, the head of the general who heads Central Command, was down there actually participating much more so than previous instances since he took over at CENTCOM in the drills. And so now, and his, obviously, I mean, we've known since his confirmation hearings last year that he's extremely eager, as much as anybody, to, now that Israel is falls under CENTCOM, and the Abraham Accords ball is rolling, and Israel is trying to build this NATO-style alliance in the region with the U.S. backing it. He's very excited about getting missile and air defenses integrated and launching basically targeting Iran and building up this coalition led by the U.S., with Iran being major justification for these countries that have a lot of differences. I mean, particularly when it comes to the Israeli apartheid state. If you have an enemy in the area, then you can justify a major arms buildup and people putting aside their differences, which is kind of the plan that they're going with here. So while nuclear facilities would be the target in the simulated drills, there's no sign Iran is looking to build a nuclear weapon, which was affirmed, of course, by a recent U.S. intelligence report. And before that, it was the Nuclear Posture Review from last year, and then also the National Defense Strategy, which all confirmed that Iran is not seeking nuclear weapons. Now, often missing from the conversation, of course, is Iran's civilian nuclear program is the fact that Tel Aviv possesses a secret nuclear weapons program with an arsenal of nukes that the U.S. does not acknowledge exists. And as I usually point out, one of the reasons why is because amendments made to the foreign assistance laws in the 70s preclude us from providing military aid or financial aid to clandestine nuclear powers. So the report comes amid heightened tensions between the U.S. and Iran in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. seizure of a tanker carrying Iranian oil in April provoked 2 Iranian tanker seizures in retaliation, and the U.S. responded by beefing up its military presence in the region, sending 3,000 Marines and sailors into preparing for this confrontation, which they're training with Israel for as well. Okay, so now, just because there was this deal done earlier this week between the U.S. and Iran, with Qatar mediating, which we'll get to in a moment. I wanted to go over this article from Dave on September 4th. IAEA report shows Iran slows its enrichment of uranium at 60%. I know, Kyle, you covered a story that you wrote that's similar to this one earlier on the show in a previous episode, but there's so much propaganda floating around right now about Iran's nuclear program and how horrible of a mistake this deal was, paying this ransom for hostages, and they're just going to put their money into their nuclear weapons program, that I think it's worth covering this again. So Dave writes here, a report from the International Atomic Energy Agency shows Iran has slowed its enrichment of uranium at 60% purity, the Associated Press reported on Monday. Now, Iran began enriching uranium at 60% in response to an Israeli attack on its Natanz nuclear facility back in April of 2021. And this was when the indirect negotiations in Vienna had started. When they were announced, Israel attacked an Iranian cargo ship in the Red Sea. And then when they began, they bombed the Natanz. They sabotaged the Natanz uranium enrichment centrifuge building facility. So this level of 60% for the purity for the uranium hexafluoride is the highest uranium enrichment Iran has ever done. It's still well below the 90% needed for weapons grade, and there's no sign Tehran is planning to build a nuclear bomb, which was recently affirmed by, as we mentioned earlier, a U.S. intelligence report. Now, according to this IAEA report obtained by the IAE, Iran has 121.6 kilograms of uranium enriched at 60%, compared with just over 114 kilograms in May. So those numbers mean Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium is growing at the slowest pace since it began in 2021. And of course, there was a pledge made in 2021 as well that they would never exceed that limit of that 60% limit. So the revelations come as the U.S. and Iran have been working to exchange prisoners in a deal that will also give Iran some access to frozen funds held in South Korea. Earlier this year, a series of reports said the U.S. and Iran were close to an interim nuclear deal that would involve Iran stopping 60% enrichment and receiving some sanctions relief, but that arrangement never materialized. Due to opposition from hardliners in Congress, the Biden administration's dealings with Iran are generally kept secret, so it's unclear if there is a potential deal on the table related to Tehran's civilian nuclear program. Iran hawks in both the U.S. and Israel point to Tehran's uranium enrichment as evidence that the Iranians are racing to build a bomb, but they oppose the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which capped Iran's enrichment at only 3.67%. And, of course, instances like this, which we're going to get to here in just a moment, this deal that was done this week, it sets off a lot of alarm bells in the Israel lobby. Places like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, as we talked about last week. Mark Dubowitz penned an article where he made the case recently that it would be better for Israel and the United States if Iran would just finally enriched to 90% or more, so that we can just completely rule out any possible diplomacy with the Islamic Republic, that's what they want. So it's, that's why everybody's in panic mode right now this week. So this next piece I wrote for antiwar.com on September 10th, Iran-U.S. prisoner swap and funds release imminent and Qatari mediated deal. So as a result of the deal made possible by at least 8 rounds of shuttle diplomacy mediated by Doha, the U.S. and Iran may soon be conducting a prisoner swap. Now, this agreement will additionally see $6 billion in previously frozen funds belonging to Iran transferred to banks in Qatar, where the money will be spent on food and medicine, according to 8 Iranian and other sources speaking with Reuters. So on August 10th, Tehran released 4 citizens from prison into house arrest, where they joined a 5th. Now, at least 3 of them had been accused of spying and cooperating with Washington. The 3 known prisoners tentatively being released are businessmen Siamek Namazi, who's 51, Imad Sharki, who's 59, along with environmentalist Morad Tabaz, who's 67, according to the White House. Now, an equivalent number of unidentified Iranian prisoners held by the U.S. for alleged sanctions violations will be released concurrently. Now, a source briefed on the discussions told the outlet that the Qatari-led mediation gained traction in June. At least 8 rounds of talks have been held since March of 2022. Now, the earlier rounds of talks focused on the nuclear issue before focusing on the prisoner swap. And so one of the sources said they all realized that nuclear negotiation is a dead end and shifted focus to prisoners. Prisoners is more simple. It's easy to get and you can build trust, adding, this is when things got serious again. Now, per the agreement, Qatar shall implement a financial arrangement in which Doha will cover the banking fees, as well as monitor how Tehran spends the funds to ensure there is no violation of myriad U.S. sanctions. During the swap, according to three of the sources, both groups of prisoners will transit Qatar. Now, a senior Western diplomat remarked that Iran initially wanted direct access to the funds, but in the end agreed to having access via Qatar. Iran will purchase food and medicine, and Qatar will pay directly. Washington agreed to have the frozen funds, which are proceeds from past oil sales held in South Korea, transferred to restricted accounts held by banks in Qatar. However, no money is going back to Iran directly, as a U.S. State Department spokesperson stressed. The U.S. will have oversight as to how and when these funds are used. And the White House has not yet commented. Well, this was earlier. They've discussed it since. But the deal to unfreeze Iran's money has been characterized by GOP hawks as a ransom being paid by the White House for the release of U.S. prisoners. Now, the negotiations which led to this arrangement were led on the U.S. side by former Special Envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, who was, of course, targeted and sidelined, reportedly by hardliners in both Washington and Tehran, as he was attempting to negotiate that separate interim nuclear deal, which we just mentioned, which would have seen billions more in Iranian funds unfrozen in exchange for Iran limiting its uranium enrichment and its continued cooperation with the UN nuclear watchdog. So in June, Malley was placed on unpaid leave, and his security clearance has since been under review for the mishandling of classified documents and so forth. Now, at any rate, Tehran appears to be making good on its part of the deal, based on the International Atomic Energy Agency document that Reuters reported on last week. Although Israel will not be satisfied if these developments help make future diplomatic engagement with the Islamic Republic possible. And so, maybe most importantly, on that same day that report came out, we had Mossad chief David Barnea coming out at a security conference and claiming that during the past year, Tel Aviv has foiled 27 assassination plots against Jews and Israelis across multiple continents, without providing evidence, of course, while speaking at a security conference, as I said, on Sunday. So Barnea threatened that Israel now will be conducting more murders in Iran. He said these prices will be exacted deep inside Iran, in the heart of Tehran. Now, Tel Aviv regularly carries out sabotage attacks against Iran's civilian nuclear energy program. Last year, Israel ramped up its drone strikes in Iran, which have continued through this year, while waging a substantial assassination campaign inside Iran, where they targeted aerospace engineers, scientists, and military figures. Israel often attacks Iran or spreads propaganda regarding its nuclear program when it appears that there may be some successful engagement between Tehran and Washington. So earlier this year, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned that no deal the U.S. makes with the Islamic Republic will prevent the Israelis from attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. Notwithstanding the Israeli claims, the CIA and the Pentagon have say that there is no evidence that Iran, a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for over 50 years, is seeking a nuclear bomb. Israel has never signed the NPT due to its open secret nuclear arsenal, which is thought to contain hundreds of warheads. All right, so it was incredible. I mean, if people want to click that link, it's kind of funny because Barnea doesn't present any evidence, but he says we foiled these attempts in Asia, Africa, South America. It's just ridiculous. I believe Nikki Haley has said that the Iranians are the worst killers in the world or something like that, too. It's just amazing what these people can get away with. Okay, so this next story is by Dave DeCamp. U.S. takes step to clinch prisoner swap with Iran. So this was on September 12th. The U.S. has taken another step toward completing a prisoner swap deal with Iran that will involve Tehran gaining access to $6 billion of its own frozen funds. This was from an AP report on Monday. Now, last week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken signed a sanctions waiver allowing the transfer of $6 billion in frozen Iranian funds from South Korea to Qatar. In a notification to Congress sent on Monday, Blinken said the funds would be placed in restricted accounts and that Tehran would have access only for humanitarian trade. Now, Blinken also said that the U.S. plans to release the 5 unnamed Iranians who have been detained in the U.S. over allegations of sanctions violations, and in return, Iran is going to release these 5 Americans who were recently put on house arrest at a hotel for the swap. The sources also told AP that they expect the prisoner swap to happen as early as next week. The news that the U.S. and Iran have agreed on this prisoner exchange was first reported by the New York Times at the beginning of August. Now, Ron hawks in Congress are furious with the Biden administration over the deal. And as I said, they're portraying it as a ransom, even though that $6 billion is Iran's money. In fact, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby had to explain that to a Fox News reporter yesterday, in fact, almost like she was a child. He had to go this is Iranian money. And you could, I mean, it's just incredible to watch the press conference. I mean, how the mainstream media is so hawkish on Iran that they make people like John Kirby look, by comparison, honest and reasonable, which shouldn't be possible. But that really was what was happening. And they were just suggesting that all this money is going to go into Iran's, nuclear weapons program, terrorism. And doesn't this send a message that, that the U.S. is weak and allowing these countries to walk all over us, and we're encouraging people to take prisoners of American citizens and all this, and it's just ridiculous. But all right, so the prisoner swap signals that there may be more room for diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran. Now, Senator Ted Cruz claimed on Monday that the Biden administration established a secret nuclear deal with Iran that's being kept from Congress. Well, that may be, I mean, we've heard McCall say things somewhat similar about Robert Malley. And he was one of the people cheerleading his, him being kicked off of his post, basically. And he had even said that it's possible that this guy has committed treason. And so these are just the most pro-Israel, anti-Iran hawks. I mean, Bob Menendez, Lindsey Graham, or some other ones that come to mind. But you can see that they're very concerned if this deal actually works, because what they're trying to do is build up, as I say, this military alliance to go after Iran. And so in order to curtail China's influence in the region and to get Israel normalized by the Muslim world, absent any concessions when it comes to the apartheid regime in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, or the, lifting the blockade on the open air concentration camp Gaza. They don't want to have to do any of that. It's just supposed to be only benefits for Israel and the United States. And as I say, you need Iran in order to do that. They have to be the boogeyman in perpetuity. So keeping with that, this is from, I wrote this for the Institute last night. U.S. Bahrain signs security agreement and invite other nations to join. So Washington and Manama signed a strategic security and economic agreement which furthers plans to build a U.S.-backed military alliance eyeing Iran in the region on Wednesday. Now, concurrently, protests against human rights abuses inside Bahrain are ongoing, and the White House is striving to forge a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal. So dubbed the Comprehensive Security, Integration, and Prosperity Agreement, the deal was signed during a meeting at Foggy Bottom with Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Bahrain's Crown Prince and Prime Minister Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa. Now, Blinken said that the agreement would boost intelligence and military cooperation between Washington and Manama. And additionally, there's a provision in the agreement which allows both sides to invite other nations to join the pact. And this is what a senior White House official speaking under the condition of anonymity told the New York Times. So per the new deal, if the Gulf island nation comes under attack, Washington would then consult with Manama to determine the best way to, quote, confront the ongoing aggression, the official said. Reuters reported U.S. officials described the deal as legally binding, but clarified that it does not reach the threshold of a NATO-style Article 5 mutual defense commitment, which is, of course, reportedly anyway, what Riyadh is seeking in order, or at least that's one of the major demands that Riyadh is seeking in order to have this normalization deal with the Israelis. They want an Article 5 mutual defense commitment, that kind of level of commitment from the United States. So this is from Blinken. We're looking forward to using this agreement as a framework for additional countries that may wish to join us in strengthening regional stability, economic cooperation, and technological innovation. Blinken declared this at the signing ceremony. And he's, of course, particularly in the last several months, been pushing Arab nations to normalize ties with Tel Aviv. The administration believes deals like these will be enticing to Riyadh and other regimes. I mean, all the articles basically say, this could be something that would work with Saudi Arabia. Of course, the White House is attempting to get this deal done between them and the Israelis. And it's just funny to see, join us in strengthening regional stability. Well, Israel is just bombed Syria again. They've drone striked Iran. They're carrying out They're going to launch this assassination campaign. They bombed Lebanon earlier this year. They've, launched a major bombing campaign in Gaza, committed a massacre in the Jenin refugee camp. They're expanding settlements and setting records for construction in the West Bank, and building these alliances. All this does is raise tensions in the region, as we can see when you're stealing Iranian tankers. Then Iran responds, and then they send in more troops and sailors and Marines, and to go in there and to what? Prepare for another war. We're just training for war, selling weapons to these authoritarian monarchies and dictatorships in the Gulf. And all that does is encourage people who, resent that to either attack the United States. All we're doing is setting the stage for larger conflicts. There's so many different tripwires right now in Syria. And so, of course, there's no way that these deals are fostering regional stability. And when it comes to economic cooperation, technological innovation, like what Blinken is saying, that's just not true. There's massive hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of trade going on between China and the Arab world. And so a major part of these arrangements, the U.S., and this is one of the reasons why the Saudis may not go through with this thing, is because when they made the deal with the UAE, they were promised F-35s, and they haven't gotten them because the U.S. is demanding that in order to have access to those warplanes, that they're going to have to stop working with the Chinese tech giant Huawei. So those negotiations were effectively canceled. And so the Saudis are paying attention to that you don't always get what you want, even if you do what you're asked to do, which is to recognize Israel without any, without the Palestinians getting their own state. And of course, this is becoming increasingly unpopular in the region. And so, and it's not technological innovation. China is doing incredible things technologically. And so if we're trying to split off this whole region from China in order to maintain our dominance, especially with the military, within the military framework of building these different of building this alliance and this coalition, that's not positive for anybody except maybe executives at Lockheed and Israeli settlers who want to continue getting away with killing people and taking their property. So So now, additionally, as I said, we're looking. So Blinken is trying to. Let's see. Prince Salman boasted that this deal forms the foundation of a new global architecture. He added, "It's an open agreement. We'll be welcoming more members, hopefully." So again, as I said, they're trying to add more and more countries into this. Now, thousands of American troops are based in Bahrain. It's ruled by this notoriously authoritarian monarchy, and with the assistance of military forces from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Manama brutally cracked down on Shiite-led protests during the Arab Spring, which called for an elected parliament and a constitutional monarchy. Now, Bahrain hosts the headquarters of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, along with the Navy's Fifth Fleet, and is one of Washington's major non-NATO allies. And of course, that doesn't carry, as we said, a defense commitment. A NATO-style defense commitment. Now, in 2020, Abu Dhabi and Manama became signatories of the Abraham Accords with apartheid Israel. The accords are a thinly veiled foundation for a regional military coalition led by the U.S. and Israel targeting Tehran. So the Joe Biden administration has come under pressure from congressional hawks since the first year of his term for not expanding the Abraham Accords enough. And there is support in the legislature as well as the Pentagon, and specifically Central Command, for integrating air and missile defenses among these nations as a way of fostering this burgeoning military alliance. And it's not just, Republicans and Democrats and insider, just pro-Israel Iran hawks that are pushing this thing, like typical hawkish members of Congress. Even Vivek Ramaswamy, the guy running for president, who's supposed to be the anti-establishment candidate, says he wants to basically double the size of the Abraham Accords. He wants to do Abraham Accords 2.0 and beat Trump at his own game and show Biden how pro-Israel he is. He wants to add, Qatar and Indonesia and Oman and Saudi Arabia as well. And so, according to the White House, this new agreement will facilitate the process and build up the region's maritime domain awareness. Now, Iran has begun seizing those tankers in the region as a response to the U.S. repeatedly pirating its tankers, utilizing the guise of sanctions enforcement and profiting millions of dollars by then selling off the Iranian oil. So, the White House has continued its pattern of escalation by expanding the U.S. military presence in the region in preparation for a conflict with Iran. Israel consistently attacks Iranian tankers and ships carrying oil to Syria, Tehran's a war-torn ally. And under the Abraham Accords, Gulf dictatorships such as Bahrain, as I say, recognize Israel without an end to the apartheid regime and in turn receive access to these advanced American weapon systems. Washington is attempting to, of course, use this to box out China in the region. The normalization agreement has also been severely unpopular in the UAE as well as Bahrain as a result of the Israeli war crimes that have been going on, especially since Netanyahu took power again last December. Bahrain's supermajority Shiite population is ruled by the Sunni Muslim Al Khalifa royal family. Shiites are subjected to discrimination and political repression. And during the Arab Spring protests, the regime where many were tortured and given life sentences. Even the State Department has conceded Manama's abysmal human rights record, including torture and cases of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, harsh prison conditions, including lack of sufficient access to medical care in prisons, arbitrary detention, political prisoners, arbitrary or unlawful interference with privacy, restrictions on freedom of expression, the press, and the internet, including censorship, substantial interference with the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of association, restrictions on freedom of movement, including revocation of citizenship, and restrictions on political participation. Now, Saeed Ahmed Alawadeh, the director of advocacy at the UK-based Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy, complained to the New York Times that this new deal constitutes a reward for the monarchy, which it could interpret as a green light to redouble its repression. And on Tuesday, the day before the deal was signed, hundreds of prisoners in Bahrain ceased their hunger strikes against their cruel conditions, which had gone on for more than a month. Rights groups explained that the prisoners halted the strike due to detrimental effects on their health and Manama's promises to improve the situation. In support of the prisoners, street protests were also launched in Bahrain. Now, the senior White House official speaking with the Times went on to insist that Washington does not, quote, shy away from the human rights file with Manama. And then, very strangely, I'm not sure what the point he was trying to make here was, although I do agree with him. Prince Salman stated during the signing ceremony that in the world today, quote, people are faced by a number of choices, either the rise of authoritarianism or the growth of libertarianism. And it's pretty obvious which side of that divide Antony Blinken and Prince Salman are on. Just an odd note to leave off on. I was surprised to see him say that. Okay, so now moving to Syria. This is a piece I wrote for the Institute on the 12th. Clashes continue erupting between U.S.-backed militias in East Syria, civilians killed and injured. So fighting between the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces and the Arab tribesmen aligned with the Deir ez-Zor Military Council erupted again on Monday night in eastern Syria. This was from a report in the New Arab. Now, both sides used to be united in the fight against the Islamic State. However, now that the terrorist group is all but vanquished, ethnic tensions amongst the two groups, exacerbated by the illegal U.S. occupation, have turned into clashes during recent weeks. So per local sources speaking with the outlet in the town of Abu Humam, SDF drone strikes killed an elderly man while he was working on his agricultural land. And further SDF drone attacks on the banks of the Euphrates River close to Abu Humam injured 2 men and 3 children. An unidentified drone, likely belonging to the SDF, targeted a vehicle as well in the area and wounded 2 civilians. The sources added that the fighting has resumed in the eastern Deir ez-Zor province because the SDF attempted to breach the Al-Latwa neighborhood located in the town of Diban. And after the SDF suffered casualties, the attacks ceased. And prior to fighting with the resisting tribal militias in Al-Latwa, the SDF claimed it had seized full control over Diban. Though Washington has backed some Sunni Arab groups such as the DEMC in the region, the U.S. mostly relies on the SDF to control roughly a third of Syria, along with the majority of the country's oil and wheat resources. There are about 900 U.S. troops and an undisclosed number of contractors embedded with the SDF. So in Deir ez-Zor, Damascus controls the area west of the Euphrates River, while Washington and their SDF proxy occupy Deir ez-Zor east of the river. As a result of the illegal occupation, the Kurds have dominated the area, much to the disliking of the Arab population. A Syrian journalist, Ibrahim Muhammad, has explained that most people living in the province, quote, categorically refuse to be ruled by the Kurds. The fighting started late last month when the SDF arrested the leader of the DEMC, Abu Qala, and since then over 100 people have been killed, at least. Now, the Islamic State took over large swaths of eastern Syria and western Iraq as a result of the failed regime change operation, which saw the CIA arming and funding rebel groups, including al-Qaeda affiliates. And the proxy war did kill hundreds of thousands of people, but ultimately failed in its attempt to overthrow the government in Damascus. So the terrorist group was all but destroyed by Damascus with its Russian and Iranian allies. But the American occupation continues indefinitely, designedly depriving Syria of vital resources amid Washington's economic war. But I do find it very interesting, as Kyle, you've mentioned previously on the show and in your articles, that Joshua Landis's observation that it's going to be the United States may ultimately not be able to reconcile the national ambitions of both of these groups, and it may be ultimately the end of the U.S. occupation in Syria, which is probably the best thing we could hope for. All right. So, so this last story, amidst all of this, Israel carried out more airstrikes in Syria and killed 2 Syrian soldiers. So this is from last night, September 13th, by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. So Israeli airstrikes bomb targets near Syria's Mediterranean Sea port city of Tartus on Wednesday, killing 2 Syrian soldiers, Syria Sana news agency reported. The report said that the strikes targeted air defense positions. On top of the 2 Syrian soldiers that were killed, 6 more were wounded, and there was reportedly material damage. So Sana, a military source speaking with Sana, said at 17:22 this afternoon, the Israeli enemy carried out aggression with bursts of rockets from the direction of the Mediterranean, targeting some of our air defense positions in Tartus. And the strike marked a rare daytime attack, as Israeli airstrikes on Syria are typically launched late at night or early in the morning. The attack on Tartus marked at least the 24th Israeli bombing of Syria this year. And Tel Aviv, of course, usually frames the airstrikes in Syria as operations against